Now we have a product name, we can finally create a repository for start storing the source code and documentation. So the first setup as part of the code section of this project is to create a Git repository. Git, if you don't know, is the source control tool, which basically means the tool in the system that's going to monitor and maintain changes and requests to change in code. It's the way you manage code typically in teams or even individually to make sure that you can save your changes, you can work on branches and features, and it makes the general workflow of code much nicer. So for this, I'm going to use GitHub. GitHub's used by Microsoft and I believe owned by them now as well. They also have a lot of tools built in that I've not used before, including GitHub projects. And I'm going to use the issue tracker and the system of GitHub a lot more than ever before in this project because it's an open source, community driven project. I feel that GitHub lends itself perfectly to this scenario. So let's just get going. I'm just going to open up GitHub on the computer, start creating the repository, talk through some basics, and get it pulled to my computer ready to work on. So just jump on github.com and create an account if you haven't got one. Then all you have to do to create a repository is to click the plus and click new repository. And a repo, as most people will call it, is almost like a folder. It's basically a project, a group, an entire thing that you're tracking as a single entity, so you're working on. I have a preference, or I did have a preference, to kind of split the work up in multiple repositories. Like, so an Android app would be in one repository and iOS in another. This is not the normal way of doing it. It's not the favored way. And after I've done that for a good few years, I've made tools to support that kind of workflow. I've realized really just make a more top level repository for the whole project. So in this one, we're going to have a single repository, obviously now called Blueberry. And that will host everything for this entire project, the whole source code. We'll talk more about what you expected to put inside of the repositories. Like you wouldn't go put in typically raw Photoshop files or video marketing or certain things like that, content, media heavy stuff inside the Git. Git is normally for code or assets as part of websites, specific things for coding, not necessarily the whole project storage. So we'll also have to think about and discuss where we're going to store other things on top of the code, but that's for a future video. So Blueberry. So description at the minute, this will be the new diabetes. It's not specific to diabetes, but for now I'll just put the new diabetes app I'll just put the new diabetes app. We can think of a description. If you've got an idea for one, leave a comment. We'll make it public. I want everybody to see this. We want to initialize it, because if you don't initialize the repository, then when you pull the repository to your computer, which means effectively, download it and start synchronizing, your computer will then complain that there's no files, and then you'll have to do an initial commit, which basically just means it's more work for you. So just click initialize with a README. We can then edit the README. It's also good practice to have a README, because then if people go to that page, if they go to github.com/angel6/blueberry, then this README file will be the thing they see. Anybody that visits that page. So it's a good place to introduce the project, which we'll also do. A git ignore file is if you commit things to source control. Say you've got a C# project and you build a console application and you're committing that to this source control environment. So you want to save your main CS file. You want to save your actual source code. You want to save your solution. But then when you build the project and it makes temporary things like a bin folder and an object folder, you don't want those going into your source control because they're temporary files, they're generated files. So the purpose of a git ignore file is to tell Git what files to not monitor, because by default it will monitor every single file in the folder, absolutely everything for any change whatsoever, and it will then be part of the change history of your project, which you don't want. You don't want temporary builds constantly changing. So we do want to add a git ignore, and then we've got a bunch of options. You can go through and see which ones you want. Now, I rarely create one through this. I normally create it through, I'm not even sure, to be honest. I think I've had a git ignore file for that long. I've probably just copy and pasted it over and over. But you've got options for languages. Visual Studio, there we go. So that one will link it to the environment, which will then be obviously any .NET language. So that'll give us a good start. We can always add to this, and we do. but that's now going to create some ignores. So if we create the repository, and there we go, we now have the initial repository with the little description. And you can see this bit here, what you see whenever you visit a code repository. This text here is this README file. So when we edit that README file, you'll see the changes here. So we'll do that in a minute. So the next step is anybody now that wants to join this project can come to this page, github.com/angel6/blueberry. They can click start to basically put in their kind of favorites like they've started. It will also watch it for them then, so any changes will be monitored. You'll get an email when I do any commits, things like that. If you want to download it to your machine, which we'll do in a minute, to start following along with the code and potentially doing your own thing, you go to this clone or download button, and then you don't want to download a zip unless you just want a one-time copy of the current code. You can do HTTPS or you can do SSH. Now, I'd recommend SSH. I'll do a separate video on this next on how to set up your machine to be able to clone for SSH. This machine is already set up for that. So all I'd do with this is copy this text here that it's giving me. Then I'd go to a location on my machine. So I just go to D drive, Git, and these are all the projects. So I would typically now make I think actually if you clone it into this, it'll make a folder. So just go to your top level Git where all your other projects are. Go into the command line, just type CMD into the address bar and open a command line. And then in here, you just type git clone and then paste that address it give you. Now, if you haven't already installed Git or any tools, before this will work, you will need to go to git-scm.com/download/win. Then it will download, well, you want to download the 64-bit unless you're on some magical 32-bit Windows machine that still exists. Click this install, whiz through the options, all defaults fine, and accept. That will then get you Git on command line, which is what this Git command will then work from. And now you can do clone, which basically means pull the code from this address here on GitHub, Angel6 Blueberry, and also to then monitor, create like a bi-directional link, which again, I'll explain in future videos. We won't go into detail about the whole Git flow. We just want to get it to the computer. So if you press enter on this, you can pull. Now, this will work before you've set up SSH because this is a public repository. So if you're trying to clone an SSH repository that needs a username and password, then you'll get the issue where it's saying unauthorized. So I will show you how to do SSH setup on your machine in another video, but you don't have to do it to get this to work. So you should see basically this, that it will clone, it will pull from the remote, which is GitHub, and it'll retrieve them. And if you look in your folder now, we've got a folder called Blueberry, and you can see we've got these two things. We've got a git ignore, which, as I mentioned, has all of the files to ignore. You can see it's going to ignore temporary solution files, temporary user settings, debug and release folders, bin and object folders, log folders, then Visual Studio specific stuff, test stuff. It's got just a whole bunch of typically temporary files in there, so they won't get commit. So for example, if I were to make a text file and call it .suo, it wouldn't be visible. It wouldn't get tracked and monitored. You can see a hidden, if you've got hidden folder view turned on, you'll see .git. Don't delete this, don't mess with this. This is the Git source control. You mess with this and you can't recover the Git really. You've got to delete it, start again. Otherwise all the tracking's kind of gone. So don't ever touch that hidden Git folder. So to show you just a real quick way of pushing changes and pulling changes, which is the first step, I want to edit this README file. So I'm just going to open it up on my machine, and it's this README file on screen here you'll see. Just install this update a minute. Try that again. So you'll see this is now the README file. This is in what's called a Markdown format. So again, I'll do a short video on what Markdown is so you understand, but you could open this in. If you haven't got Typora installed, which is what I use, I'll leave a link in the description if I remember. If not, just type Typora into Google. You'll right click, open with, and I can say just open this with Notepad a minute so you can see what it is. You'll see that it's still just text, that's all it is. But special things like a hash and then a space create a header. And if you click back, you can do 2 hashes to create a secondary header slightly smaller. And you can do other things like 3 lines to make an underline. So it's kind of like almost a developer-friendly coding document, because before Markdown existed, in the days of like C, C++, going back even further than that, when you used to just do command line, or you had MS-DOS, or however you were doing it, you'd make documents yourself, and you'd be doing things like this. You'd be making little tags, and you put a header like this, and then you put a secondary header like this, and you kind of make this sort of layout anyway. So Markdown become the natural sort of progression of that to make it so that you could actually type like that as a developer, but then see nicely formatted visuals. So just moving on to this, we're going to just do a quick change to show you. So I'm just going to capitalize Blueberry. And then this is where we got a description. So let's just change the description for now and just put, welcome to the new open source £100,000 diabetes project. In this, I aim to create the entire applications and system for a new diabetes app that helps. How much slower do you type when you're talking back to yourself? That helps diabetics manage and have more fun managing their condition. Condition. So there's just a change. I've saved the file and closed it. Now you can see if we refresh here, nothing's going to change. We haven't what's called pushed our changes. So if changes have been made by somebody else, and on this page now there's changes that I don't have, or I go to a new machine and I want them new files, it's called pulling. You're pulling down from the server. So you can imagine you're pulling the files down. If we've made a change like on this local machine, and we want to give that back to the original source, the remote server on GitHub, it's called pushing the changes. So you just think of it naturally. You're pushing your code up, or you're pulling it down. So in order to push the changes we just made, the way Git works is you have to do commits. You have to commit your changes in chunks of commits. And you typically do this as small as possible. So I've made a README file change. Typically it wouldn't be that small, but in this case it will be. So I want to commit that change, and I want to give it a little message for any other developer what's just changed in code. So to see that, you can just type in the command line git status. But first we've got to browse into that Blueberry folder, because we're in the top level folder still after the clone. So just type cd Blueberry. Just see if I can make this bigger as well, because this will be quite small. Defaults, font, 20. What I need to do is get a smaller monitor, so that my text is naturally larger, so that my videos don't have to be huge text every time I'm recording them. Right then, so that's better. So we just cd into Blueberry, and now if we type git status, it will effectively look in the Git folder here for the original, its known current position and what files should be, and it will compare them to the real files outside and figure out that we've clearly modified README. Now there's more things to this, a lot more to this that you can do, but the basics there is that the Git has got a change of README. So in order to commit that, we can type Git Add, and you can add just that file. You could add the readme.md. If you wanted to add every file, you could do Git Add, I think it's -A, I might be wrong. Yeah, Git Add -A. Like that, and that would add every changed file, every change you've made if you want to just push every change. Once that's in, do git status again, and you can see now it's green. Green means it's ready to commit, so it's not just floating as an unstaged change. So again, there's 2 concepts before you push. You pull the code first, so you've got the latest code, then you make a change to a file and save it. At that point it would be red in here, and it's classed as an unstaged change. So you can think of it as sitting in the audience in a theatre. The developers that are making changes are sat in the seats making changes. They're not on stage. They're just making changes that no one else is aware of. When they're ready to push it live, go live to the audience, they want to put it on the stage, ready to then get it approved and pushed. So you add the file by doing git add, and it turns green. Now it still isn't in the server. It's simply ready on your machine to set up to make a commit. This bundle of code changes ready to push live. So it goes from you make the change, you save it, it's unstaged. You do git add to add the files that you want to now commit as changes, because you might have made multiple changes and you don't want to necessarily push them all right now. You're still working on some other features, but you've completed this set of features and you want to actually push that live now. So you can select files that you were ready to commit, hence why you have the staged and unstaged. If you only had the ability to commit, you'd have to commit every change you've made and you couldn't selectively pick files. So we've staged our README file and in our status, there's nothing left, there's no red. So everything is on the stage ready. So now if we type in git commit, that will now commit everything that's in green on here. So it's going to commit that file. And to commit the file, we really need to give it a message, because when you start looking back in here at your commit history, you can see every commit has this text here. You have to have the text. So in order to do that, we give it a message, and it should be meaningful. So you type -m and then put some quotes, and inside the quotes, give it a message. So I'll just put initial readme file needs some work and press enter. And you can see now initial readme file needs some work is the commit. It's now been given a git ID. This is now the commit ID, which if you went into here, you can see here. It's a short version. The full one is down on the status bar down here. If you look, a really long key. But this has now got a local key on my machine ready to go. As 1 file's changed, there's 5 lines inserted and 2 deleted. So that's all good. So at this point, let's check git status again. You can see now it's saying that effectively there's no changes. There's none of this changes. There's nothing to commit. The working tree is clean. It means everything's up to date. But your branch is ahead of origin master. Now what that means is our local machine, our branch on the local machine is ahead, as in, it's in the future, of origin master. Well, origin, in this case, is github.com. And the branch we're currently on as master, that's the only one we have, by 1 commit. So what it's saying is our machine now, because you can have a Git repository on your local machine that never has a remote server. So you can make a folder on your machine to work locally and use all these Git features to manage your code changes and never leave your machine. You don't need the remote server. But because we have one, this is telling us the origin, which is the source where we want to push it to when you're pushing changes, is actually behind our code. We've got a commit in front now, locally. So all we need to do to finish this and to push it up to the server live is to do git push. And that will then push it, and you can see it's done all the work, compressed it, pushed it live to github.com. And finally, if we go back to our repository on here, you'll now see the changes are live. And you can go into commits, and you can see the commits are now here, and by who. So there seemed like a lot of steps there, but let's just refresh all we did. It was fairly simple. So we did git clone in the top level git folder, and then if we went back to the top, we clicked this clone or download and copied this link. That would pull all the code down. We then cd'd into the Blueberry folder. You then made your file changes, so we edited the readme file. And then typically when you're ready to push, you just go git add -a, and then git commit -m, and your message, and then git push, those 3 steps. Now, you don't have to do this in command line, so don't worry too much about all this command line stuff, because this is where people start getting put off. They're like, I'm never going to remember this, there's too many things. Don't worry, you need to know the command line just so you know the principles. Then you can jump onto a visual tool. So like I use Git Kraken. And you can use Git Tower. That was also really good when I used to use it on Mac. When I moved to Windows, Git Tower wasn't on Windows, but it is now. And you can open up in Git Kraken. You can go to, we haven't added it yet. In fact, we should have it in here, Blueberry. So now visually here, you can see the difference. So I'll go through using a visual tool in another video. But for now, you just want to familiarize yourself with pulling down from the server, committing, and pushing back to the server. And we'll go through more Git specific tools after. But if you want to just see the code changes that I'm doing and not necessarily make any code commits yet, you don't have to worry about anything except doing the initial git clone to pull the code. And then once you've got that, just open up that folder where the files are, go to command line and type git pull. That's all you ever have to do. And every time you do git pull, you'll get the very latest code. If you then make changes and mess with that folder, then you'll obviously have to clear your changes to pull again. Otherwise, it'll complain that you've got conflicting changes. But you could always just redo for now, git clone, and just that one command each time, git clone, it'll keep pulling down the latest code into a folder, and then just delete the folder when you're done and clone it again. So that's the basics of Git covered. You now know how to create a repository, make it public or private, get a git ignore file, and pull it to your machine to start using. We'll obviously cover this in a lot more detail as we progress with the project, showing you how to do pulls, pull requests using git flow, merge conflicts, all the kind of things that you need to know in Git. It's not that scary, it's not that difficult. Quite a lot of people can be put off by it and don't understand it at first, but it'll take maybe a week to get familiar with it and to understand, and then you'll find it's a really useful tool. And as always, this is a free project done entirely by myself with no funds, so the donations you can give me will really help this project get to market fast and better the world.